Hi, I'm Laura Palmer of Island Crime, and I'm this week's guest on MetaPod.
You're listening to MetaPod, where we unpack the web's most interesting podcasts and the stories behind them, hosted by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.
Greetings, MetaPodders. I'm Wendy Morrill.
And hello, I'm Kevin May. Welcome to another episode of MetaPod, our 18th, in fact.
For the first time, Kev, we're not recording this with both of us on the same continent.
What? Where the heck are you? You didn't tell me this.
I know, yeah. I did kind of sneak off, but of course I haven't abandoned my MetaPod duties. I'm actually back in the US, in my home state of New Hampshire, for a family visit. And, well, I guess you're still in Bishop Stortford.
I really, really like it here. But actually, I have to say that because I can't really leave still. Right, so tell me, have you bumped into our previous guest and New Hampshire's most famous true crime podcast host, Jason Moon of Bear Brook at all?
Sadly not. No Jason Moon sightings so far.
This is a big shame.
Yeah, but I'm sure he's busy working on the local news beat or maybe even a new podcast.
Okay, so MetaPod this week is focused on a place across the North American continent from New Hampshire, where you are. We are going to Vancouver Island in Canada's British Columbia.
That's right. We speak to Laura Palmer of Island Crime, a podcast that emerged last year with its first season called Where is Lisa? The podcast concentrates on Lisa Marie Young, a young woman from Nanaimo who disappeared under very strange circumstances in 2002.
That's right. Very strange is a bit of an understatement, actually. I mean, as Island Crime explains, with suspicions of institutionalized bias against First Nation people, as Lisa was, by the police, and widespread suspicions in the community about the perpetrators of the crime that have been around for almost 2 decades now.
Laura Palmer, now that's the former producer for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, not the Twin Peaks character. She wanted to produce a podcast that focused on Lisa's story, and the more she looked into the case, the more odd it became.
It's a gripping tale, and one that, as we discussed with Laura, became increasingly unsettling for Laura herself as she got closer to key bits of information around the case.
Yeah, so let's pick this up after we play the interview, as there's plenty more to discuss.
There really is. So start the tape, if you will.
Hi, Laura. Welcome to MetaPod. Thank you for coming to talk to us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
So, Laura, you are the presenter of a podcast called Island Crime, and the podcast has 2 seasons, the first of which is titled Where is Lisa? And that's the one we'll be focusing on today. Could you briefly tell us who is Lisa and why is her story so important?
So Lisa Marie Young was a 21-year-old woman from a small community called Nanaimo on Vancouver Island. She vanished in 2002. And Lisa is someone that I feel like, well, everyone in Canada should certainly know about. And I actually think her story is so compelling that I feel like it really should have had a bigger international audience as well. I got to know her really well through her family and friends over the course of a year-long investigation. Focusing on her and her story was something that I wanted to do, and really kind of less about, no, I shouldn't say it's less about the crime, but certainly at the outset of the season and early on in my investigation, I was all about wanting to learn about Lisa herself. I mean, everything I learned about her told me, although what people typically notice about her is her, her beauty, her absolutely stunning good looks, this was a young woman with a lot of promise as a human being. And the other thing that I should include in describing her is that she's a First Nations person. And for listeners outside of Canada, you might also hear a description of her as Indigenous. Mm-hmm. So in Canada, Indigenous women are far more likely to be victims of violence. And in recent years, there's been a real focus on that. But at the time of Lisa's disappearance, that wasn't true. And her Indigenous heritage likely played a role in why her the missing report was not taken as seriously at the outset, and perhaps played a role in why the investigation wasn't as vigorous as it should have been. But her Indigenous heritage was an important part of who she was. And, her grandpa, who's the chief of her First Nation, talked about, deep regret that he didn't get that time with Lisa when she was young to help her understand that part of who she was in life.
So is there for those who don't know where Nanaimo is or where it's situated, is there something that we should know about Nanaimo to better understand Lisa's story? Yes,
of course. Sorry. So Nanaimo's a funny place in that it's a port city on Vancouver Island. People probably, when they think of Vancouver Island, if they think of Vancouver Island, they would think about Victoria, which is the capital of the province. Nanaimo is the second biggest city. And unlike Victoria, it doesn't really have a reputation for being much of a tourist destination. In some ways, it's kind of down on its luck. It's a bit of a rougher town, I would say, than Victoria is. Although, having said that, it is very pretty and it's got a lot of beautiful nature around it. But in recent years, the past few decades anyway, it has also had a bit of a reputation for a crime problem, a gang problem, a drug scene as well. And all of that is the backdrop for Lisa's story.
At the start of the series, so I should just say, the season is titled Where is Lisa? So obviously Lisa is missing. And at the start of the series, you give the impression that the answer to her story or the crime involved in her story is actually in the community in Nanaimo or on the island there. Yet it remains unsolved after so many years and nobody's been brought to justice. Leaving the victim and her family at this sort of level of urban legend. What's the sense that the answer is in the community? Can you describe that? Is it a hunch? Are there facts that are well known to everyone in the community? Can you describe how?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that intrigued me about Lisa's story right from the start. She disappeared on the Canada Day weekend after going out for an evening with friends. So she leaves her home and her dad says, even going out that night was kind of an unusual choice for her to make because she was moving the next day. She was about to start a new job. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of late and her dad is encouraging her, maybe you shouldn't go out, but it's a friend's birthday and she takes birthdays very seriously. She's big on celebrating birthdays and going big. And she says, no, I'm going out. So she goes out quite late in the evening. She goes out to a local bar, which is at that point called the Jungle Cabaret. And as far as we know, everything goes fine out at the club. They're having a good time. They leave the Jungle Cabaret at closing time. And it's there in a parking lot that she encounters a young man who, as far as we know, she's never met before. He is the grandson of a prominent realtor in town, and he's driving a red Jag. Now, as you can imagine, in a small-ish town like Nanaimo, somebody, especially back in 2002, driving a red Jag, handsome, kind of preppy looking young guy, is going to stand out. Mm-hmm. And he approaches the group where Lisa is and starts chatting them up and offers to drive them to an after party. Back then, and probably today, when a bar closes, it's not unusual for people to want to go and keep the party going. And so Lisa and her friends go with this guy in his car to a house party. They actually go to a couple of house parties. And it's at the second house party that it's like now getting quite late in the night, or early the next day, I should say. It's about 3:30 in the morning when Lisa allegedly says she wants to get something to eat. She's a vegetarian, and I guess nothing at the house is good for her to eat. The guy in the Jag overhears this and offers to give her a lift to a late night restaurant. So she goes with him. The next thing anyone hears from Lisa is a couple of communications she makes from the red Jag. One of those communications is to her friend Dallas Hulley, with whom she was celebrating that night. It was Dallas's birthday. And she says, this guy didn't take me to the restaurant. I'm sitting here in the car. They won't let me leave. Come get me. Now, unfortunately, Dallas has he's been drinking all night. It's, a number of people talked about how he was pretty drunk when he left the jungle. And he himself said, I was drunk when I got that call. And he didn't really understand the seriousness of it, and basically says, well, just get out of the car, just leave, and doesn't alert anyone at that time. The police aren't called. And unfortunately, that is the last anyone who knew her heard from her. In terms of when I say in the podcast, there is so much that seems to be known in the community, what happened after Lisa makes those calls, a number of people in the community seem to know about and seem to have been there. Mm-hmm. The names are quite well known, although I don't say them in the podcast because no one has ever been charged. Mm-hmm. But, I have talked to so many of her friends and family and people, credible people within the community. And the story is quite consistent. As, you'll hear in the podcast, I do eventually speak with the investigating officers in her case. And I ask them, is there anything you heard in the podcast that you want to clear up? Anything that's not true? And they say no. Like everything that I say in the podcast, everything that's been told to me by her family and friends and those close to Lisa is, as far as they know, true.
So I was just going to ask, Laura, if we can. I mean, this is terrific background, especially for those that haven't listened to the podcast yet. I'm curious. So Lisa disappeared in 2002. You picked up the story a year and a half, 2 years ago. Do you sense there was much investigating going on about her disappearance in those intervening 16, 17 years or so?
I feel like, and I've said this in the podcast, the investigation at the outset was problematic. Lisa's family talk about calling the police the very next morning and saying, look, something is wrong. She should be home and she's not calling us back, and this is not normal. But what they say happened is the police who came out kind of said, hey, she's young. She's probably out partying. She's probably, had a little bit of a bender. This guy is about to go off for a few days. This is a Sunday that he's come, and he's not back at work till Friday. And he says, if she hasn't showed up by Friday, get back in touch. Right away, they know that's not going to be what they're going to do. The police response is not satisfactory. So straight away, they're out looking for their daughter. They're marshaling the resources of the community, including Lisa's First Nations community, who are the ones to put together a search group and go out searching for her in those early days. But it isn't until probably about 10 days later that the RCMP first start talking in the local press about how this is being taken more seriously. You know, the original stories from the time talk about how they don't suspect foul play and there's nothing to indicate foul play. But it's about 10 days into it that they do seem to realize that something has gone wrong. And over the years, Lisa's family, her mom, Joanne, are just like dogged and determined to keep the public and the police focused on Lisa's case. They do like really everything they can to try and raise awareness and keep the police focused on it. But I really did have a sense, although the police, you know, say it's always remained open and active, I did have a sense, and Lisa's family and friends would say this as well, that it wasn't really until the past year when the podcast really got a lot of attention that things started to pick up in terms of new interviews happening and most recently new searches happening as well. I feel like there was a long period of time where nothing was really going on. And it's only recently that Lisa's case is starting to get a bit of traction again.
I'd like to come back to that, if we may, at the end, just an interesting part about the acceleration of it and how a lot of the investigation has taken a couple of interesting developments over the last couple of years. Before we come to that, the point where you said, Laura, there, that it was a missing persons case and then it took them 10 days before they kind of got serious. Do you think they kind of got serious about it because they were then learning about some of the things that people were talking about, as in there may have been a crime committed rather than someone just running away? Was it that spurred the police into action and then the publicity started? And the reason why I asked that, the context is people disappear all the time. And usually, I'm just thinking of experience here we've had in the UK very recently, someone disappeared overnight and within 24 hours, it was all over the BBC News because the police knew that there was something already slightly strange going on. So what is it that propelled the police after 10 days to say that they thought there was a crime had been committed?
You know, there's a lot about Lisa's story that is puzzling to me. And that is one of the things that I still don't understand and have never really had what I would say is a satisfactory explanation from the police on. When I asked Lisa's father, Don, how quickly they knew about the calls Lisa was making, saying that she was in this car and wasn't able to leave, he said right away, pretty much the next day. So to my mind, that would have signaled right away that there is something wrong. And, the investigation should have been stepped up right at the outset. But the police, don't actually interview the driver of the red Jag until later in August. When I interviewed them, they seemed to take a measure of pride in identifying the driver and having that interview with him. I don't know. It feels to me, and again, this is armchair quarterback from down the years, but I just don't really understand why that took as long as it did, given the size of the community and the unusual car, and the fact that, it seemed many people were able to identify him right away. So I don't have a good answer for that. I don't know why it took as long as it did, and nor do I really know why they suddenly did start taking it more seriously, although quite late, I think.
Forgive me, I can't remember which episode it is in, Laura, but you talk about the suspect, the driver of the red Jaguar, and how he now, as far as you're aware, resides in Japan. And at the end of that particular episode, you put out a plea for him to get in touch so that you can talk, making an assumption that he didn't, or what happened with that plea was, did you get any information maybe through a third party about his whereabouts or whether he would or would not be keen to talk to you?
So he has never gotten in touch with me. I have tried everything I could think of to interview him. He, according to people close to him, moves around quite a lot. It's not clear to me that he is still in Japan. I wondered with COVID if he had returned home, but I don't have any information either way on that. The closest I got to him was speaking with family members. And I will say, no one would go on the record about him. I did speak with
just to interrupt. Interrupt, Laura.
Yep.
Why do you sense that people don't want to go on the record and talk about him?
Let's just say he is a controversial figure even within his own family. This is a guy who is racking up a bit of a criminal record even back then. So, he comes from a privileged family, and he's a handsome, kind of preppy looking young guy, but he's already getting into trouble back then. And when this incident happens, I'm told it really split the family apart. There are people within his family who don't talk to each other anymore because, some people think he didn't know any more than he said to the police, and others believe perhaps he did. And so that has really split his family. The people who were willing to speak with me off the record and not for attribution were worried that, if they were the ones to come out and say things, either way about him, that it would further damage relationships within the family. And so as much as within his family, there is, regret for whatever role he played that night, empathy for sure for Lisa's family, there is also just an unwillingness to stick their necks out and be the one to talk about him.
So I think you get the idea from the podcast that much of Lisa's family, friends, and the wider community have done a lot over the years to keep her story alive. Where does the decision to make this podcast come in? Was there the idea that you could find out new information by widening the audience for this, or was it to warm up the local audience?
So when I started work on the podcast, I had just finished a lengthy career at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and moved to the island because my husband got a job here. I had known about Lisa's story for a long, long time, but it wasn't until I moved to the island and left behind my life in daily news and current affairs that I had a chance to really dig into her story. And I would say at the beginning, I thought I would, talk to her family and friends, paint a bit of a picture as to who she was, describe the circumstances kind of as known. But I didn't really imagine that I would dig up new information, spark really basically a new investigation from the current police. I didn't think that was going to happen. And I think in part, I had assumed that everyone who could be talked to had been talked to. But that wasn't at all the case. There were so many people who I talked to who had never talked to the media, who had never talked to police. Although my goal at the outset was, really to do justice to Lisa and her story, I didn't understand that there would be much more that I could do for Lisa and her family just by talking to people who had never been talked to before.
If I may, Laura, it's interesting that you say that because it's almost you're memorializing her in a very respectful way and talking about in those first couple of episodes, there's interviews with people that talk about her life. And then there's a definite shift from it being a kind of, as I say, memorializing her and her life, and it's the tragedy of her disappearance. And then it becomes more investigative. Is that because as you interviewed more people, just more and more things started to almost not make sense? So you started digging around a little bit?
Yeah, that's exactly
The
right.
tone definitely shifts. The tone definitely changes, doesn't it?
It does because, and I will say this, I love the part of the podcast where I get to know Lisa. And I don't know, for me, that's probably always going to be my favorite part of true crime storytelling, really the focus on the victim and the family and the impact and all of that. But it was impossible not to take it further when I was daily for a while getting calls and emails and messages and people wanting to talk who had information and and surprising things, like a woman who spoke to me who was working at the jungle that night, who saw the guy in the red Jag, who talked to Dallas that night and talked to Dallas in the days afterwards, and saw Lisa, and had never been interviewed by the police, which just seems strange to me.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could tell us, Lisa had aged out of foster care, if I understood correctly, and the reasons for her placement in foster care are not really outlined in the podcast. Was that too sensitive to include, or considered irrelevant, or something else?
I would say a little bit of both. Lisa and her mom were not getting along. That is why she was in foster care. But Lisa's mother has passed away, and that aspect of Lisa's life was never talked about in the coverage of Lisa's case before. Not at all. In large part, that was because, Lisa's mother had a lot of regret and probably guilt about those circumstances. And she was really the driving force behind keeping Lisa's memory and story alive and pushing for answers from the police. And, my sense from talking with Lisa's foster sister and her dad and her family and friends was that, they didn't get along, and they were not getting along, but they still had a relationship, and they were working to rebuild that relationship when she disappeared. And so I just felt like I didn't see the point of going too deeply into those circumstances, because I didn't think it had a bearing on her disappearance. And, I do respect Lisa's family so much, and they were open to talking about that part of her life, but only so far.
Could you tell us what the relationship has been like between local media since the podcast has come out? Did it accelerate like the story itself seemed to? Yeah,
so there are a couple of local reporters who take every opportunity to talk about Lisa's case. And one reporter in particular, Kendall Hansen, who has been on the story from the very, right from the very early days. He was out on the searches. He became very close with the family, and in particular became close with Lisa's mom, Joanne, who, he describes as forming a friendship with, that Lisa's mom started coming to church with him and his family. And in the end, he was a pallbearer at her funeral. This reporter is very, very, very deeply invested in Lisa's story and does everything he can to stay on top of the story. He's he works in a daily news capacity for a local TV station, Check TV. So he can't spend the kind of time I was able to spend on Lisa's case. But I would say the podcast has just been another way for people like Kendall and like some of the other local reporters to find new hooks, new angles, new ways to bring her story to the local community. Because as much as the podcast and the podcast success is important, the answers to finding Lisa and finding justice for her family will be found within the community, like right there in Nanaimo. Yeah. And so those local reporters and their storytelling is really, really important.
And has there been international media interest in the story since the podcast?
No, there hasn't been, and I will say this, I feel like, and, we kind of haven't gotten into all of the kind of twists and turns that make this such a, I think, fascinating story. But there are so many things about Lisa's case that make it, well, heartbreaking, but also just a really interesting mystery, that I feel like if it wasn't for the fact that she was Indigenous, Canadian, from a small town, that there would have been a lot more interest, Like, I think if she was a 21-year-old American white woman that this had happened to, I think Dateline would probably be all over it,
Mm-hmm.
But that's not been the case. And really, I think her family are just, well, happy is not the right word. They are pleased that it's getting the level of attention it is now, and that's important to them.
A related question to an earlier one, Laura, and it starts off the podcast by saying it won't talk much about the disappearance of Lisa and some of the details around her disappearance and the kind of the speculation and perhaps what happened to her. But by the time we get to the end and you've got that really amazing interview with the forgive me, I can't remember his name, who talks about some circumstances where she may have been in a house and there may have been whether it was an accidental death, I say in inverted commas, but you know what I mean. What that is alluding to is pretty rough stuff. But at the beginning, you said you weren't going to talk about some of those details. What changed your mind?
Yeah, so this podcast, I would say, unlike many true crime podcasts, is evolving in real time. I started out with an arc of what I thought the narrative would look like, and imagining the episodes to come. And then, unfortunately, the reality got in the way of my planned storytelling. So I had thought that, there's all this stuff out there, all of these stories kind of swirling around Lisa's disappearance. And I didn't really think I was going to be able to get people to talk to me who had actual information about some of these things. And without that, I didn't want to get into those aspects of the story. But as things worked out, people were coming forward and directing me to other people who I should talk to. And so, early on, when I spoke with Kendall, the reporter I mentioned earlier, and I asked him about some of the things that were being said and some of the rumors. And he believed and believes a lot of that stuff. And I said, well, I don't know. I don't know. And I'm reluctant to kind of go there. But because I was able to talk to people who had direct information, I did include some of that in the podcast. And as you referenced, Bob in particular, whose story is the last current episode of the podcast, does corroborate a lot of the rumors that are out there.
There is a fairly chilling part of the podcast where you are driving to somebody's house and you think there is another car following you.
The interview I am about to do will be difficult. There is a lot at stake. As I drive down an especially steep, winding stretch of road, rain pelting the windshield, I'm aware a dark-colored SUV is following too closely behind me. I check my rearview mirror. Still there. Still too close.
And then it all suddenly gets quite serious, doesn't it? Because you are just the teller of a story and going to interview people, but then you must have felt that you were in danger of being part of the story at that point. So 2 questions really is, did that come to nothing? And were they just your fears about another car following you up the mountain? And how did you consider your own personal safety from kind of that moment onwards as you were learning more?
I have at various points in working on Island Crime had serious concerns about my safety. That's simply because although, this is a case that is decades old now. And I really, at the outset, felt like, I'm just telling a story that dozens of other reporters have told before. Because I have gone further and explored the story in so much more depth, I have at various points worried that some of the people who are involved and who are still out there living here on the island, that they might decide that, they would want to send me a message of some kind. I have only named one of the people in the podcast, the driver of the red Jag, because the police did confirm to me he was the driver of the red Jag, and his name, and that's all I've ever said about him in the podcast. But I haven't named some of the other names that I know, in part because they've never been charged with anything, and I would not name someone that I didn't know to have a direct link. But these people know that I know who they are. And so, and the island geographically is big, but it's small. And I guess the other thing I would say is that one of the people who's believed to have been involved in her disappearance is feared to this day by so many people.
Right.
I don't know, I've probably had 50 different people warn me that he's a violent psychopath. And even though he's much older now, he has a lengthy criminal record. But, all that said, this is Canada. This is not Mexico. These are not cartels. I don't think journalists typically are hurt by criminals here. And as I think I say in the podcast at some point, my husband is a judge here. And I really don't think any criminal is going to want to focus on a journalist whose husband is a judge. Like, can you imagine the heat that would bring on? Right?
Sorry to laugh.
Yeah, it would not be a smart idea. And I have a huge dog as well.
Is the discovery of her body, is that the big development really that you're waiting for? Or I say you and the family and the police and the friends, that would perhaps solve the case, wouldn't it? Because they could do forensic and DNA and all those kind of things.
So there are people in the community who have information who could walk into the Nanaimo RCMP station today and solve the case. And tell the police where to find Lisa. Within Lisa's family, I think I mentioned earlier about Lisa's grandpa, who's a chief of Lisa's First Nation. He's in his 80s now, and he would like to bring Lisa home so that the traditional ceremonies, which are accorded to an Indigenous person in Canada, could happen for her. And he wants that to happen before he's gone. So bringing Lisa home of course, would be huge for her and her family. But I will say, I asked that question to Lisa's father, Don Young, and for him, it's important for sure, but justice is more important for him. If he could find Lisa, but it would in some way hurt a possible case, if somehow the discovery of her body happened without going through the proper channels or whatever, he has expressed some concern in the past that if anything ever happened that undermined a potential criminal prosecution, he wouldn't want that. I can't really imagine that scenario. I think finding Lisa's body I think you're right. I think that is one of the only ways that justice will ever happen for this family. But for him, it's not as important as making sure whomever was responsible is held accountable.
And you said a number of people could just walk into a police station or a police office on Vancouver Island and tell the police where to go. It is the fear of the repercussions potentially that is preventing them from doing that, is it?
Yes. Like to this day, some of these people, and one in particular, is deeply feared here.
Yeah, interesting. We're coming up to the end of our time here with you, Laura. Do you think we've spoken to a couple of true crime hosts, podcast hosts here on MetaPod? And there've been fairly different opinions on the role of social media and Facebook groups and things like that. And some would argue that they are very helpful because you have lots of amateur web sleuths that are coming up with ideas and suggesting leads and angles and things like that. And there are others who are less positive about such things. Where do you sit on that kind of debate? We know that the family has had a Facebook group and things like that for a while, but where do you sit as an investigative journalist on that?
So I would sit on, I do think they are helpful. And some of that depends on the nature of the group. In Lisa's case, her friend Cindy Hall runs her Facebook group, and she keeps that group really focused and purposeful and respectful of the family. And it doesn't, become a place for people to swap theories and opinions and, get into some of the kind of lurid aspects potentially of the story. It's not that. And she is always reminding people, thousands of people now who have joined the group, that Lisa's family are in this group. And, this is all about justice for Lisa. And we're not going to do anything here that's ever going to hurt the family or hurt that cause. And I would say, as I've mentioned earlier, that the community has information. And if this is a place where that information is going to surface or start to surface, that's helpful. I talked to one former police officer early on in this series who said the police should be paying attention to what the community is saying because these are the people who know things. And so, yeah, they should be going out and talking to people on the street, but also these groups are where actual people with actual information are to be found as well. So I do feel like they're helpful. I can see how sometimes they can be harmful as well. But in Lisa's case, her Facebook group, I think, has just been a really positive part of the story. And if I could, I'll just mention, they do things like for Lisa's 40th, she was a fitness fanatic. And so for the last 40 days, people have been encouraged to do a little fitness challenge where they were posting pictures of, walking and hiking and, even a guy who is in a wheelchair was like getting out there, all in Lisa's name and memory, and saying she would have been 40. We're going to spend 40 days focused on fitness and health in her memory, because so much of the story is so dark. And that's not really what Lisa's life was about. And her friends wanted to do something that was just like more positive. So when you ask me about, the role of the Facebook group, in her case, I would say it's been, yes, both purposeful in terms of the investigation, but also really positive around her memory as well.
So much of this story is about the disappearance of Lisa, what she was like as a person and your investigation, but there are arguably some fairly deep-rooted issues that you discuss and almost expose with around potential kind of institutionalized racism against First Nation issues and things like that. How do you kind of feel about bringing that into the story?
Well, I think you could not tell Lisa's story or any story of an Indigenous woman in Canada right now without talking about racism. This country over the past few years has been, involved in a huge national inquiry looking at the thousands of Indigenous women who have been murdered and are still missing in Canada. It's an issue that unfortunately is not going away. The rates of violence against Indigenous women in Canada continues to be a huge problem here. And so I just couldn't imagine a world where you could tell Lisa's story without getting into that. If anything, I would say I regret not getting into it in kind of a deeper
Right. That
way.
was going to be my next question is, it's almost another couple of episodes of that story is just going into the kind of the depth of why such things have come about and the problems that you say still remain.
Yes. I think there is room for more storytelling around that. There's been some really great work happening in Canada. And I don't know if this is a strange thing to say or to do in the context of talking about this podcast, but there is an Indigenous storyteller named Connie Walker here in Canada who has just done some incredible true crime stories around the murders of Indigenous women. She has a new one out on with Gimlet called Stolen, which is just out now. So if that is an area of interest for people, I would really urge them to listen to Connie Walker's work.
And we'll put a link to that on the website when we post this episode.
I suppose my last question is if this institutionalized discrimination feeds into anything you're covering in season 2, Gone Boys.
Well, I would say the families of 2 of the men that I talk about in season 2 are Indigenous, and those families certainly believe that the fact that they are Indigenous and that these young men were marginalized in the community, they have issues with the investigation. So yes, I would say the same theme is playing out in season 2 in those particular cases.
The point about the sense of time and often a podcast covering a crime, some new details may be emerging as the podcast is created. And I think it's quite interesting. And at the start of this series, you explain a little bit about your career in the newsroom and that it was really, to use your words, suited to your ADD. And that now you finally had more time to spend to dig into stories that you, I guess, didn't feel like you had time before for. How do you feel about the time now, having been through this podcast? If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It does make sense. There is something to waking up every day, going in, reporting on a bunch of different stories and different topics and different issues, and then going home at night and not really thinking about it ever again. And this is really different. I, for a period of time, literally would wake up first thing in the morning. Lisa and her family was what I would think about. And I'd go to bed thinking about them as well. And I'd spend all day getting messages and emails and phone calls and talking to private investigators and just really deeply in it. And that is satisfying hugely as a storyteller, but also is hard. I did have to say to myself, okay, it's 7:00 at night. You've been on this all day. Just turn it off. You have to. At the same time, I do feel such a level of respect and an investment in Lisa's family and her story that, I'm not ready at all to let it go. And so, whenever we're kind of together online or talking, it's about things like the podcast and raising awareness, but also about any more information, anybody talking to the police, have we heard anything? As I mentioned earlier, there have been recent searches, but we have not heard what, if anything, has come of those searches. But, all of that to say that despite my ADD, if there are new developments, if I am able to push the story forward, if the police decide that they're going to reveal what has come of those searches, I will, of course, update the podcast because, I have heard from so many listeners here on the island and beyond who have just really come to care about Lisa and her family and are following along. So of course, people want to know what's happening, and I will of course update when I can.
Can you share a funny story about recording in your Honda hatchback with us?
Oh my God. Let me think.
Let's end on a lighter note for listeners that haven't listened to your podcast yet. It's worth saying that there are quite a few interviews that you record in the back of your car.
Yes. So, when I worked at the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, I had beautiful, expensive sound booths to record in. And, like really just top of the line. And now I'm on my own and I'm looking for spaces with good sounds. So blanket forts, all of that kind of stuff. But when you're recording out in the field, like really a car is a pretty good option. And while my husband loves to make fun of my Honda Fit because, as he tells me, it looks like a homeless person lives in there because it's old and it's kind of down on its luck. But it is small and comfortable, and it actually provides a pretty good audio space. So even though sometimes I feel badly for my guests because it does kind of smell of my dog and it's covered in dog hair, it has pretty decent sound. So yes, for now, that's my recording studio.
Gritty podcast befits being recorded in a gritty location, I guess.
I think so.
And your dog's name?
Bear.
Bear. Okay.
It's very Canadian, if I can say so, as someone from the UK.
Well, and at the end of this interview, he's going to get a treat because he's been really quiet throughout this podcast. He's sitting right beside me.
Well done, Bear. Thank you for joining.
Bear, your treat's coming soon. Thank you so much, Laura Palmer, for being here to talk to us on MetaPod.
Thank you for your interest, you guys.
Thanks very much to Laura Palmer for speaking to us about Lisa's case. We'd also like to thank Laura's dog for cooperating during the interview. We hope you enjoyed your treats afterwards.
Indeed we do. We also wish her and the family and friends of Lisa Marie Young our best thoughts and wishes, as when our episode comes out on May the 5th today, it would be Lisa's 40th birthday, and we know there are plans from a commemorative event in Nanaimo today.
Yes, those of you who've already listened to the podcast will know how committed the local community has been in keeping Lisa's story alive over the years. I don't sense this is the last we'll hear about Lisa, especially as the case has picked up momentum with Laura's podcast getting out there, and certainly deeper into the local community, which is where critical information will hopefully be uncovered.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's a strong testament to Laura's investigative work. There is feeling that something could happen to break the case sooner rather than later, whether it's the discovery of Lisa's body or someone finally coming forward with information that they'd happily put on the record in a court.
Yeah, we'll certainly update our pages and point listeners to any new information that Laura publishes. Also, listeners might be interested in the second season of Island Crime, which started about a month ago, that's called Gone Boys, and it's focused on vulnerable men on Vancouver Island that have gone missing.
Okay, so that's it. Another great episode and another intriguing episode is now behind us, Wendy.
And we'll be back next week with Willa Paskin, host of Decoder Ring.
Now, we love hearing feedback about our guests. Funnily enough, we appear to have spawned a number of true crime buffs of our own who will let us know their theories about one of the shows we've featured. But we'd really love it if you would give us a rating and a review wherever you listen to our show each week.
We do. We really love that. So the moment you hear Kev say, "See you next time," leave us a rating or a comment, and we'll put it in the MetaPod mailbag too.
We do need to go through the MetaPod mailbag in a future episode.
It's exploding. Yeah.
You wouldn't believe the amount of letters that are coming out of the top of the mailbag. Anyway, it is. Right. Yes, please, and thank you in advance for those ratings and reviews, and we'll see you next time.
That's it for MetaPod this time. Thanks for listening. MetaPod will be back soon with another unpacking of the web's most interesting podcasts. But in the meantime, make sure to subscribe at any of the usual places you find your other favourite podcasts. We'd hate for you to miss upcoming episodes, and we'd love it if you left us a review. You can let us know what you think of this episode by going to metapodshow.com. We'll see you next time. MetaPod is produced by Wendy Morrill and Kevin May.